Hi, folks. Welcome back. Here we are with our second week. We're talking about Thomas Hobbes now, and we are talking about social contract theory. Um, as we're going to see, we're going to have to go ahead and define what social contract theory is a little bit at the beginning before we sort of dive into the Hobbes piece. Last week, we talked a little bit about cultural relativism. I saw a lot of you folks were still on the fence on cultural relativism, and that's fine. If you want to be a cultural relativist, go ahead. Simply know that we are going to go ahead and be criticizing each other's thoughts on discussion posts and maybe even off hours. If you want to challenge me on something, if I put forward an idea, which I usually won't unless someone asks me, you're more than welcome to. So keep that in mind. Uh, we also talked about the Howard piece, which talked about how America is not for Black people, and we touched on the idea of systemic racism, but we're not going to revisit that until we get to Charles Mills. So now we got to go into the traditional Western philosophical canon, what is usually studied, and we're going to start off with Thomas Hobbes. With that said, let's go ahead and start off this PowerPoint presentation. So again, we're going to talk about what social contract theory is. We'll give a short biography on Thomas Hobbes and who he was. And for today, we're going to talk about chapters 13 to 15 of the Leviathan. We're actually going to go ahead and stop there. And we're going to talk about chapters 17 and 18 on our next recorded lecture, on recorded lecture 4. So keep that in mind. We're just talking about 13, 14, and 15 for this recorded lecture. Okay, so social contract theory, or social contract political theory. What is that all about? Well, the basic idea is this, that in some way there's an agreement between individuals that subject themselves to collective enforced social arrangements. And those arrangements therefore have some normative property. What does normative properties mean? It just means that it has some thing about it that is able to determine or affect how one should act. When people use the word normative in philosophy, they're not talking about norms or what is normal. We're talking about how people ought to act. So when we talk about normative property, we're talking about the idea that it has some type of moral power over you, whether they're legitimate, whether they're just, whether they impose obligations on you, whatever it is, they are able to have some say on what it is that you should and should not do. That's what normativity is all about in philosophy. Now, do note that the social contract or these agreements, they're often hypothetical and imaginary, but that doesn't mean they have no power, according to these philosophers. They are meant to prove that the normative property is indeed still there. So just because the situation is hypothetical or imaginary doesn't mean it has no power. In fact, it does have power, because if we were in that situation, if we were in that hypothetical situation, a lot of these philosophers argue, we would agree to the contract. We would agree to these collectively enforced social arrangements if we were in that situation. So because if we were in this situation, we would agree to have a social contract. Therefore, any social contract in which we live in today is morally authoritative and has some normative property. Historically speaking, this is not new. It goes all the way back to the Greeks. You can look at the Greek philosopher Epicurus, for instance. However, in the modern day iterations of it, we get our earliest form of it from Thomas Hobbes, who we're discussing today. It was later developed on by John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and even Immanuel Kant. We're not going to talk about Locke and Kant. We are going to talk about Rousseau in this course, however. Not because Locke and Kant are not important, just because it is a 9-week course and we had to make some cuts somewhere. After Kant, who lived in the 1700s, people didn't really talk about social contract theory, but it sort of had a revitalization in the mid-1900s with the philosopher John Rawls, which we will talk about as well. So with that said, Thomas Hobbes is the first one to sort of bring it up in Europe or in modern philosophy. What is he all about, right? Well, he's an English philosopher. He lived from 1588 to 1679, Common Era. And again, he's considered to be one of the founders, or not the main founder, of modern Western political philosophy. And when we talk about Western political philosophy, again, we're talking about philosophy in the United States, in English-speaking countries, and in Europe. That's what we mean by the West in Western political philosophy. He wrote his famous work, Leviathan, which you have to read a few chapters, in 1651. And he was inspired to write this book by the horrors of the English Civil War, which he lived through. I have a question mark next to inspired because I'm not sure if inspired is the right word. Maybe scared and motivated into writing it. I'm not entirely sure. Basically, Hobbes mostly remained in Paris during the English Civil War, and he was horrified by what he saw as the anarchy and the violence that he saw in his own homeland. He didn't like it. He didn't like the anarchy and violence he saw. It actually led him to believe that challenging the authority of the state, of the country, in his case, it would be King Charles I, is always an evil, is always a moral wrong, because challenging the state is going to lead to this anarchy and this violence. So how does he sort of argue that, right? Well, he argues it in his book, Leviathan. So before we actually dive into chapter 13, just sort of look at the artwork. I'm not sure if this is original artwork, but this is probably the most famous artwork. What do you see in this picture here? Take a moment to just look at it and think. You see a man, he's wearing a crown, he has a blade and like a staff or something, and he's looking over a village or a city or town. It might be a little hard to see here, but if you look very closely into his torso and his arms, you see a bunch of smaller people within this big sort of royal king person. This is kind of the main message of Leviathan in artwork. The idea is that the people together give their power to the king. The people together give their power to the king, and the king, whose power derives from all of the people, is able to rule over everyone else with sword and staff on hand. The sword represents power, and the staff represents their edicts, right? So keep this picture in mind as we move through chapters 13, 14, 15, 17, and 18. Let's start with chapter 13. Do note, he writes in a really interesting way. He actually moves from like main premise to main premise. And the text I sent you, the text I uploaded for you all, the premises, the main premises or the main axioms, they're italicized on the side for you. So that's actually very useful for first-time readers of Hobbes. But basically in chapter 13, he's considering what he calls the state of nature. The state of nature is just a place where, a hypothetical place that he later on says doesn't really exist for most people. The state of nature is just a place where there is no government, according to him. He begins with his first axiom, and I'm going to skip a few axioms. I'm mentioning the axioms which I think are the most important, but you're definitely responsible for all of the axioms, so definitely make sure you read everything. I'm giving you the highlights. But his first axiom is that men in the state of nature, where there is no government, are equal both in mind and in physical capabilities. Now, you might be saying, oh, isn't that like oversimplifying? Don't we have a lot of differences and diversity among ourselves? And he says, no, for the most part, people are comparable when it comes to mental capacities. And if you think you are better in your mental capacities than other people, then that's just arrogance on your part. In fact, your arrogance just makes you more similar to other arrogant people. And he says that arrogance in mental capacities is actually a very common trait. So by you thinking that you're better in terms of mental capacities, that just makes you very, what he would say, basic. In terms of body, you might say, oh, don't we have a lot of physical diversity? But again, he is going to deny diversity in this point as well. He says, sure, you might be stronger or weaker, but no matter how strong you are, most people won't be able to take on 3 or 4 of their peers and fend them off in an assault or something like that. So that's his first point, right? For the most part, sure, there's small differences here and there, but for the most part, most people are pretty equal in terms of mind, mental capacities, as well as physical capacities. From this equality in mental and physical capacities, however, we get a lack of confidence in the state of nature. Because remember, in the state of nature, there's no government. So you have to get your own shelter, your own food, your own water. However, other people in the state of nature are just as strong and smart as you. Maybe a little more, maybe a little less, but right around there. What makes you so sure that if there are finite resources, there's a limited amount of resource to go around, that you're going to be able to get your dinner, your shelter, your protection, your water? You would reasonably start losing faith in your abilities to get all that stuff. Someone might take it away from you, or the resource might run out. Diffidence is just a lack of confidence. You start to get a lack of confidence that you can get what you need. From this diffidence, from lack of confidence, you straight up just get war. people go to war with each other. And he says that there's three causes from this war, right? There's competition. If there's a limited resource, people want to get it. There's diffidence, lack of confidence. Maybe there is no lack of resource, but people are scared. They panic. And here I have the picture of toilet rolls. If you remember just a few months ago, people were panicking. People were losing trust that they can get what they wanted. And they panic bought a number of things, including toilet rolls. And finally, the last cause of war is just glory. Not to get a resource, not because you're trying to be defensive and make sure you have all the toilet paper you need, but because of glory, the glory of war and victory. From this war, you get a number of inconveniences, to put them mildly, really a number of harms, right? And this is one of his famous passages. When there's war, when every person is waging war against everyone else and is in a continual state of paranoia, we have continual fear and danger of violent death. And the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, and brutish. Not very great. Now, there's an important thing to note here, and we're going to notice this from a number of our European philosophers, white philosophers that are rather wealthy and rich and live privileged lives. But they were not the most enlightened people. In fact, they were often very Eurocentric and or just straight up discriminatory. He says, there was never such a time nor condition of war as this. So he tells us that the state of nature and this type of war never actually existed, which I think is a little weird, right? Because he had just seen the English Civil War and he was horrified by this. But now at the same time, he's saying that, oh no, the English Civil War was never a state of nature, never an extreme state of nature anyways. And then he continues, and I believe it was never generally so, not even for the English, over all the world. And he says, but there are many places where they live so now in a state of nature. For the savage people in many places of America, except the government of small families, the concord whereof dependeth on natural lust, have no government at all, and live at this day in that brutish manner. So here he is showing his not just ignorance, right, but also just straight up Eurocentric viewpoint and just discrimination, that he considers that people in the Americas, Native Americans, not European Americans, to be living in this state of nature. But for everyone else, according to him, it is imaginary. So keep this in mind, because it's interesting. He's saying that it's imaginary for most people, the state of nature, but for some select people, it's actually real. As we're going to see when we consider other contract theories, there's only going to be one philosopher, namely Charles Mills, who says that the state of nature, or that the contract theory, is real and not purely imaginary. Of course, Charles Mills is not going to be nearly as racist or Eurocentric as this, as we're going to see. Finally, his fifth axiom in chapter 13 is that in such a war, there is no morality, there is just survival. This makes people want peace, since fear of pain is greater than the joy of inflicting pain, he says. That is the end of chapter 13. And chapters 14 and 15, I'm going to put them together, especially since chapter 15 is quite short. But in chapter 14, he begins by saying, look, naturally, in the state of nature, every person has a right to everything. But as just mentioned just a slide ago, the fear and pain of loss is greater than the joy of inflicting pain and loss. This leads, according to Hobbes, to the first law of nature. A law of nature is just something that man and woman, people will naturally want to follow without there being a government to impose that law. It is a law that you will naturally arrive at through your own reason and through your own emotion. That is the law of nature. The first law of nature we get is that every man, he says, ought to endeavor peace as far as he has hope of attaining it. Basically, that every person should want to live a peaceful life, but when they cannot get peace, they should use all of the advantages of war. They should be ruthless. The first law, he says, naturally leads to the second, which is that a person will be willing to forego the right to everything, so long as others do so as well and strive for peace. But again, only if others do so, and there simply is no guarantee that they will do so. Doing this, trying to say, hey, I won't have a right to everything if you won't have a right to everything, is called a covenant, where the parties do not give each other anything in the moment, but they promise to do or not do something in the future. Interestingly, Hobbes thinks that these covenants are actually useless unless there is something to enforce them. What is it that will enforce these covenants? Well, he tells us in chapter 15 that in order for these covenants to mean anything, in order for us to be able to trust that another person won't infringe on our rights, we need what he calls a common power, which, spoiler alert, is just going to be a government. In his case, a king, but in our case, we would consider it an assembly or a Congress or a legislative branch or multiple branches of government. Okay. In chapter 17 and 18, we'll see what this common power looks like. He's going to give a lot of power to it. I'll tell you that right now. He's going to give a lot of power to this common power. Okay, that's it for now. I'll see you folks in the next recorded lecture